Member Paul Goldsmith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to speak on this, the Taxation, Annual Rates, Employee Allowances and Remedial Matters Bill. I think that previous speech was by way of saying that Labour were going to support this bill, but it was a roundabout way of getting to that story. I did want to thank members of the committee that worked together. Pay tribute to Mr. Shane Jones. The Honourable Shane Jones, who was part of the Select Committee, has now gone off to other pastures, having concluded, Mr. Speaker, that the prospect or the possibility of being an economic development minister in a party which doesn't believe in economic development was not one that he wanted to pursue any further, and so we wish him well in his career. The rest of the committee carried on, and we welcome the arrival of Mr. Robertson into the committee to work there. I was interested in the comments that the previous speaker made about Facebook. He didn't repeat his threat to close down Facebook if they didn't bow to the knee of the New Zealand taxpayer, and I think all the hundreds of thousands of Facebook users in this country will be grateful for that. Drilling on to this bill is all about building a more competitive and productive economy, Mr. Speaker, and that is one of the National's key priorities. And when we come to taxation, the most important thing is that the government can raise the revenue that it requires, not through hiking tax rates, but by ensuring that the existing tax bases are efficient and are applied fairly. So this is a piece of maintenance legislation which is about ensuring that taxpayers can understand and comply with the rules, and it's necessary for the rules to be cohesive, fair and applied consistently and regularly maintained, given the cleverness of people who seek to get around the rules. And the first thing that a government can do in tax policy is make sure that its spending is under control, so we're not having to hike rates or dream up new sorts of taxes like capital gains taxes as proposed on the other side of the House. And so this budget that we passed and we've been debating last week has reduced pressure by keeping government spending under control. We're now back to around 30% of GDP and on track to get lower for core government spending, and that means that we don't have to be quite so rapacious in our tax gathering as previous governments have been. Mr. Speaker, drilling down into the details of this bill, if we look first at around the area of employee allowances, we heard, the Select Committee heard, we received 97 submissions from interested groups and individuals, and we heard oral evidence from 30 submitters. To be fair, most of those oral submissions related to the Foreign Account Information Sharing Agreements and the FATCA legislation, and that unfortunately is not something that is not around maintenance of the tax system in New Zealand. Has been forced upon us by the very unusual tax system that the United States has, which taxes US persons rather than residents, and the changes that were being brought about through the changes that were going to come into effect on the 1 July 2014. And we did hear a number of US persons who have been living in New Zealand who were concerned about the possible ramifications. I suppose the main point to make is that this bill doesn't change tax law in the United States, and it doesn't change any obligations of of US citizens living in New Zealand. They're no different to what they were before, after the passing of this bill. What this bill does do is allow New Zealand banks to pass information on to the US in relation to US persons once they cross a certain threshold. So, that threshold will be set by the IGA. So people underneath that threshold need not worry, and it is only people that are identified as US persons. And they've had those obligations, tax obligations, and we've heard a lot of concern about this. So this is ultimately about collecting taxes across international borders, and most broadly speaking, the Select Committee did support global efforts to combat international tax evasion and accept that New Zealand's global reputation would suffer if we were not seen to be playing our part. And so, Mr. Speaker, while this is a difficult piece of legislation for some people, overall we believed that this legislation is important for the New Zealand economy. Mr. Speaker, the only other thing I would quickly draw attention to is the review of employee allowances. We heard a lot of submissions and made several changes there just to try and clarify the rules so that the tax treatment of employer-provided accommodation and accommodation allowances and reimbursements were made more clear so that taxpayers will minimise compliance and administration costs in many of those areas. And on that basis, I commend this bill to the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Speaker.
I call the Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to take a call on the taxation annual rates employee allowances.